Good evening and welcome. It is so wonderful to see this auditorium almost full, and we are just delighted to welcome you back in person, which is, really amazing for our Dino Lecture. But before I start, my name is Gaby Chavarria. I'm the Executive Director at the Burke Museum, and I'm just, thrilled to see all of you. And I wanted to start with, our Burke land acknowledgement to get us grounded for this amazing lecture tonight. So the Burke Museum stands on the lands of the Coast Salish people that ancestors have lived here since time immemorial. And many of these tribes continue to live here alive and strong. And, we have a reflection usually at the Burke that we talk about how we're feeling, after in these particular times. And I just feel really wonderful to see all of you here joining us again in person for this Dino Lecture that, is sponsored by two wonderful supporters of the Burke, Rosemary Habronock and Nathan Merble, that make this possible to bring just amazing, amazing researchers to us. And, and I just, I'm thrilled to have you here. And I want to introduce you to our dear and wonderful curator of paleontology, vertebrate paleontology at the Burke, Dr. Wilson Mantilla, who is also the Burke's Associate Director for Research and Collections. And he's also a professor in the Department of Biology, who will be our Master of Ceremonies tonight. So welcome, and I know you're going to enjoy the show tonight. Great.
Wow, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And as Gabby said, it's so nice to have this in person again. Seeing a lot of faces that I recognize and then new faces that are interested in what Jeff's about to speak about. Before we get started, hopefully you all saw the table that was set up in the entryway. This is our new exhibit, We Are Puget Sound. It's now open. It's a fantastic exhibit. Please go take a look at it. It's also a great time to get a membership at the museum. And as a thank you for attending this lecture, I want to let you all know that there is a 20% discount in the Burke store for tomorrow and Sunday. So please take a look at that. Okay, wow. Being able to give this introduction is really a real distinct pleasure for me. As some of you know or perhaps put together, the speaker tonight, Jeff Wilson Mantilla, is my brother. He's my older brother, and it gives me a really fantastic opportunity to make up for some years of being the little brother, especially in front of all these people. But no, really, Jeff and I were great friends and had a lot of fun together growing up, except for maybe a few years during high school, I think. We did a lot of exploring and adventuring together as kids in Michigan, where we grew up, and also in San Andres, Colombia, where our mother is from. But as kids, we weren't really dino fanatics. We weren't, running around with dinosaurs and knowing all the different names. We were actually more interested in sports, really, and soccer in particular. Oh, and we do have a younger sister. She's not a paleontologist. She's a nurse, okay? But after a very productive soccer career and academic career at Kalamazoo College, Jeff focused there on biology as a major. Jeff took a more roundabout path to getting into paleontology, but he eventually entered as a graduate student at the University of Chicago with the famed dinosaur paleontologist Paul Sereno. And he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago and got to go to a lot of fantastic far-off places. And that's also where he met the other curator of vertebrate paleontology. You might be able to see our very own Christian Sidor. He gave me these pictures, so he's responsible. And so Jeff at the University of Chicago studied sauropod dinosaurs, and that took him to many museums all over the world and many field localities all over the world. But he eventually, after finishing his PhD, came right back to Michigan, to the University of Michigan, our home state. And there he is a full professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and he's a curator at the University of Michigan's Museum of Paleontology. And we both work on Mesozoic vertebrates, which is pretty cool, but we work on opposite ends of the size spectrum. I work on tiny Mesozoic mammals that are, about this size, mouse size or smaller, and Jeff works on titanic dinosaurs. The benefit of this is that it's allowed us to be able to collaborate on projects. He has his things, I have my things. We work on the same time periods, and we get to travel to all kinds of different places. And this really has been one of the most personally rewarding aspects of being in the field of paleontology. So I'm very happy to finally have him here to be able to present this lecture. So with that, please let me welcome my brother, Professor Jeffrey Wilson Mantilla, who will present on living large, life as a sauropod.
I can't tell you how surreal it is to have an introduction like that. It is, but it's a real honor to be here and to have the chance to look back over, a lot of the time period that Greg talked about. Some of the pictures where you saw Greg and Chris and I eating on the porch is when a lot of this work started. And I've been interested in dinosaurs for a long time. And as Greg said, the interest in dinosaurs didn't stem from a fascination as a child with dinosaurs. Rather, it's something that emerged rather late in life, and it's tied to an interest in complexity and an interest in the relationship between biology and physical parameters. And so one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the relationship between sauropods and their anatomy and their size. That is how those things are related from an evolutionary standpoint. Okay? And just to kick us off here, we have an image. And please let me know if you can't hear me very well in the back. I'm trying to make sure that I can see the slides and also speak into the mic. And so we have an image here that's a classic image from Roland T. Byrd, who was a paleontologist that was interested in fossil trackways. And so here you see a young boy taking a bath in a sauropod footprint. And he's even sticking up his foot to show you, by comparison, how big they are. And that's one of the things that's fascinating about dinosaurs in general, but sauropods in particular, is that they are larger than life. They're super heroic. And this is a real kind of visceral image that it brings that to life. Greg mentioned that we weren't interested in dinosaurs as kids. We predate the Jurassic Park phase, and we were born and raised during this kind of a lull in our human fascination with dinosaurs. But that fascination is not one that's tied to Jurassic Park. It goes way back to when the first dinosaurs were discovered and when the first scientists figured out what dinosaurs represent. That is, they represent these large terrestrial reptiles. They're these giants, these titans that walked on Earth, like that footprint and many others like it demonstrate. And here you can see the Diplodocus. Somebody mentioned Diplodocus and how to pronounce that, this gentleman over here. This is a Diplodocus skeleton when it was presented to the British Museum in the early 1900s. And one of the things that's fascinating when you take in what this image shows us is that they had to make choices when they were mounting these bones. They had to decide if they were going to mount this giant lizard as a lizard, that is with kind of a sprawled out posture, or whether they were going to mount it in a different way. And in fact, this mount is showing Diplodocus having this upright, this vertical posture. And the reason for that is because the bones basically tell us that. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, why that's something that's related to body size and advantageous to dinosaurs like sauropods, and some other aspects of their anatomy that are directly tied to being large. But before I do that, I just wanted to very briefly acknowledge that, like any of these talks, I'm the narrator, of course, but there are many people, some of whom are even here today. There are many people who have supported this research in various ways, have contributed to it directly through innovations, through many aspects, writing papers and so on and so forth. And there are funding agencies that have supported this work throughout the years. And this is what I'll cover today is largely going to cover not all the details of my research career, but things that go back about 25 years. And so I've been thinking about these things for a long time. And as the title suggests, I'm talking about living large, the paleobiology of sauropod dinosaurs. And just to kind of get us off thinking about size and scale, as I mentioned, one of the things that's fascinating about dinosaurs is that they represent one end of the size spectrum. At some level, at least to my thinking, the other end of the size spectrum is equally interesting and thought-provoking, but somehow we're not quite as moved by it. And I think part of that is because we pass through a small phase to get to where we are. We grow through being the size of a blastula. This is a ball of developing cells in the eye of a needle. And so we start out small and we grow big, but dinosaurs and sauropods in particular grow past us. They surpass us in body size. And when you think about body size, there are many advantages that immediately come to mind. Many of you are already perhaps thinking of them. One of them is protection from predators. One of them is access to resources, larger range size, many other obvious things that go along with being big. But there are also disadvantages to that, okay? And some of those disadvantages are physical ones that are related to things we'll talk about in just a second. But first, let me show you a graph. And I'm going to be showing you a few graphs in this talk. And for those of you that are young or new to reading graphs, when you see a picture like this, start by looking at the axes. So this is the y-axis, this is the x-axis, and the x-axis down here is time, going from about 500 million years ago to now. And the y-axis here is something that's called biovolume. You can think of that as just size. And so this is a graph that's looking at size through time, through what we call the Phanerozoic, or the time during which there were fossils that are big enough to see with your naked eye. There's obviously life before that and fossils before that. But this is when you get fossils that you could go out and collect easily. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a lot of colors that represent different types of organisms. But what I want you to notice is that you have a lower line here that's representing lower end of body size or body volume, and an upper end of body volume, and a mean or an average, a running average through time. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there is a range of body volumes that you see here early in the history of organisms. That's narrow. It spans 8 orders of magnitude or powers of 10. As we go through time from 500 million years ago to the present, you can see that the trend line, the average, goes up. That is, that there is a general increase in body size that is not really the result of a change in the minimum, but really the maximum is going up. And so you have much larger organisms. So there's this general tendency within the organisms that we measure in the fossil record towards larger body size. So the size increase is something that organisms must deal with. Now, what are the disadvantages of being big? We can think of this rule that we call the square-cube rule. And the square and the cube here are referring to powers, exponents rather than the shapes. Okay, so if we have cubes here that have a given length, and we can think of this length as being 1, as we increase this length to 2 and to 3, you can see that we're multiplying the length by 2 here and by 3. But what happens, of course, because the area is length times length, we go up not by 2, but by 2 squared, or 4 when we're looking at the surface area of this cube. And then here we're looking at the square of 3, or 9, for the surface area of this face of the cube. If we look at volumes, the volume of this cube is 1 times 1 times 1, which is 1. And this one is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. And this is 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27. So you can see the volume goes up much faster, even in this very simple example. The volume goes up much faster than does length and than does area. Okay, that is if we keep shape the same. And so we can expect certain relationships that lengths in general are related to mass in this way. So lengths cubed will kind of be similar or proportionate to mass, and lengths will be proportionate to masses to the 1/3 power. So kind of keep this in mind. You don't have to remember the exponents or anything like that. Only that as you get bigger, volume goes up much faster than does areas, than does lengths. I'll explain why that's important in just a minute. But just to give you a human example, or a musical example. I love music, but I'm not an expert in music at all. But you're listening to of instruments, of stringed instruments that are the same or very similar in shape, but different in size. And so they have different surface area to volume ratios. So the surface area is the area of the surface that's vibrating to make the sound, and the volume inside of it, those are different, and they sound different, and it has a beautiful result, right? And so there's this difference that we have that you can sense just by listening to this. If we think of this in a human context, we have, I've given you inches, imperial over here and metric over here. Average height for males is about, I'm blanking, 1.7 or 1.75 here. Okay, and I've just chosen images of people that you might be familiar with, but you can see a human male on the smaller end of the size spectrum and a human male on the larger end of the size spectrum. And what I want you to do just before I show you a graph is look at how this figure here is the height and this figure below is the weight. Okay, look at how height and weight change. So less than a meter tall, 18 kilograms. Almost 3 meters tall, 200 kilograms, right? So more than 400 pounds. And so actually, if we graph these heights and weights, height is related to, height squared is proportional to weight. It's not the cube in this case because shape is changing. It's not the same shaped human. You can see that there's a lot more torso here and a lot more leg here. But you get the sense that as you get bigger, you get much, much, much heavier. And it's one, you all will know this just by watching, if you've watched a basketball game and you've watched the way the guard runs down the court and the way the center runs down the court, it's a very different thing. And so the most athletic humans tend to be near average size, not much higher. In fact, Michael Jordan is quite an exception in that sense. And acrobatic and gymnastic humans are lower than average height. This is because of that surface square cube rule, because as you get tall, you get so much heavier. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the strength of bones and the strength of muscles is related to their cross-sectional area. So as humans get larger and their volume goes up by the cube power, the muscle mass goes up by the muscle strength and the bone strength go up by the square power. So they're lagging behind if nothing else changes. And so here you're looking at a human leg, and in cross-section you can see the bone. There's the tibia, there's the fibula, there are the compartments of different muscles. And so when you make a muscle and you're showing how strong you are, what you're showing is not the length of the muscle or the volume of the muscle, it's really the cross-sectional area that's important, those fibers that are going past one another. That's what's important. Similarly for bones, cross-sectional area is what determines the strength of that bone. So to be big, organisms face a challenge that's related to just the dimensionality of size, of just physics, essentially. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about today is how sauropods as model large organisms have circumvented or have kind of met the challenges imposed by the physics of being large. And I think, or I've conceptualized that there are at least 4 different ways that organisms can do that. One of those ways is simply to change shape to increase surface area. Okay? And there's an example here of the intestines where, not only are intestines very long, but they're very complicated. And so digestion is something that occurs across a surface. And so if you're a big organism, you need to have a lot of exchange across that surface. And so the shape of that surface has changed. There are also allometric changes, like a certain dimension could increase much more rapidly than other dimensions. In this case, you're seeing the earliest depiction of that from Galileo, where you have a little bird bone, an example of what he imagined a large bird bone would look like to accommodate large size, so a big cross-sectional area. There are material property changes, like the way that the structure is made can change. In this case, I'm showing you a wishbone. You've probably played with these in Thanksgiving, and the reason that it's a good bone to kind of play with that way is because a lot of the bone has been replaced by, or contains a large component of elastin. It's a stretchy, bendy bone because the wishbone acts as a spring when the bird flies. When the bird's wings go down, the bone bends, storing energy like a spring, and when the wings go up, it bends the other way. And so it stores energy and it increases efficiency. Another aspect is behavior. That is, there are behavioral ways that organisms can get around or can maximize their surface area. And this is an example of huddling in rodents where their surface area is shared, and so they stay warmer longer. And so that hopefully will make sense to you. So I'll talk about how sauropods did it in the context of these strategies, if you want to think of them that way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about sauropods. These are fascinating animals, and when I started working on them, that is when I was a graduate student with Chris Sidor, I was one of the few people that was working on them. It was like a territory that was just, I felt it was mine to romp around in. And now it's crowded with lots of people, and I'm still working on sauropods because I find them still fascinating. But you're looking here at an image of the very sauropod that Greg showed you a picture of, Paul Serino and I excavating, an animal called Nigersaurus. This is a depiction of Nigersaurus eating in an aquatic environment low to the ground. Okay? So sauropods are dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are a specific group of animals that includes birds. So you can see the birds here. So in that sense, dinosaurs are not extinct. There's 9,000 species of them on the planet right now. So they're not extinct. They're closely related to predatory dinosaurs, like the Tyrannosaurus rex that's in the Burke Museum. You can see the Tyrannosaurus right there. So this is the part of the family tree corresponding to that, the immediate relatives of birds. The sauropods and their relatives occupy this kind of from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock part of this diagram, and they represent about, let's say, 1/5 or 20% of dinosaur diversity, perhaps a little bit more nowadays. But that's roughly what they represent. And they have a body plan that is very distinctive. They have a barrel-shaped body. They have 4 columnar legs, a long tail, a long neck, and a very small head. And probably all of you recognize that as their body plan. In some ways, they're kind of they've been stereotyped that way as being this kind of monolithic group that doesn't change very much through time. But trust me that they do, and that's why there's 20% of dinosaur diversity is within this one radiation. And so they originated about 210 million years ago, and they went extinct about 65 million years ago. One of the reasons that they're so fascinating is that they are at one extreme end of the body size spectrum. And so you're looking here at an adult reptile. This is a chameleon on the tip of a match, right? And so you can see it's absolutely tiny. But this is a reptile. This too is a reptile. It's 22 meters long, so 30 millimeters, 22 meters, okay? And so there is a 1,000-fold difference in the lengths of these organisms. And so if anybody's got really good eyes in the back, you can see there's a tiny dot that this arrow is pointing to. Maybe you can't even see it. There's a tiny dot there. That represents the length of a chameleon, that chameleon, compared to Mamenchisaurus, this dinosaur from the Jurassic of China. And so if you were to, let's say, want to line up those chameleons' nose to tail to make up the length of Mamenchisaurus, you would need 1,000 of them to do that. If for some strange reason you wanted to paint the Mamenchisaurus with chameleons, you'd need 1,000,000 of them to do that, because we're now talking about an area. If, for some even weirder reason, you wanted to fill Mamenchisaurus with chameleons like a giant reptilian gumball machine, you'd need 1,000,000,000 of those chameleons to do that. Now, the cool thing to me, at least the scientifically cool part of this to me, is like those animals are made from the same or very similar materials and a very similar body plan. They hatch from eggs. They start out small and they grow from that. One of the things that maybe you didn't know is that sauropods start out small. And this is one of the, think about this for a minute, that being big, all the reasons I talked about for why it's advantageous, defense from predators, acquiring resources, big range, they are not available to the smallest members, the smallest individuals, right? Because sauropods hatch from eggs that are quite small. In fact, this sauropod, if I can just have a tiny little cul-de-sac in this talk, just to say, I mentioned that there is that I've worked in India with Greg for a long time. 2 of our Indian colleagues are sitting here in the audience. The fellow who found this specimen is sitting right here, Dhananjay Mohabbi. He's India's premier researcher in the geological, paleontological realm. He found a site, if you can believe it, that contained a snake inside of a dinosaur nest eating a hatchling. And this sculpture, this little cropped out picture is just, I wanted to show you what the hatchling looks like. So we know they're about 1/2 meter long because we have hatchlings. So sauropods start out 1/2 meter long and they grow to be about 22 meters long. So they have to grow a lot. And so this is showing you the size of a hatchling sauropod compared to an average or slightly above average adult. And so you can go through the same routine I went through with the painting and the gumballs with just ontogenetic. That means throughout their life, how much they change. So they're part of a big range in body size evolutionarily, but also within their lifetimes. They go from being small to being quite big. So whatever skeleton they've evolved has to be good at small size and at large body size. Okay? And so I'm going to talk about perhaps the most obvious and in some ways the most surprisingly boring aspect of sauropod anatomy, because sauropods are the predominant megaherbivores, the biggest and the most widespread, at least in the Jurassic and then in the Cretaceous and the southern land masses. They're everywhere. They are predominant. But they have not really evolved anything sophisticated in their skulls to eat plants, not at least compared to other herbivores. So I'm showing you here a side-by-side comparison between a sauropod, it's a cute little image of a sauropod, and a duck-billed dinosaur. So these are animals that emerged, let's say, very roughly, or their lineages emerged very roughly at the same time. They lived in similar, not the same, but similar habitats. But the organisms over here developed beaks, they developed cheeks, they developed complex tooth materials, they developed different types of teeth, crushing teeth, biting teeth, and so on and so forth. And so the hadrosaurs did quite a bit with the architecture of their skull to process plant material in their mouth. We think they chewed, they processed their food like we do. Sauropods, in contrast, we think didn't. Why? Well, one of the reasons why is that they had incredibly small heads. Imagine that, like you're trying to feed, an organism's feeding a very large body with a very tiny head. It's a poor design. If you're chewing every bite, It takes a long time to do that, and so it's not efficient. And so sauropods never evolved any of the things that we know other dinosaurs are capable of evolving. So they don't have cheeks, beaks, they don't have complex teeth, they don't have heterodonty, that is different teeth in different parts of their mouth like we do. They didn't do that. They have simple dentitions, and for the most part, simple skulls. And so they haven't sort of allometrically generated these massive heads that they're eating with all the time. They haven't done that. They have small heads. And so they've done other things to probably increase their ability to bring in food to support their body. And one thing I'll say that I don't have a slide for is that, like other herbivores, sauropods could not break down plant materials, the cell walls of plants. And so they had to have symbionts, microbial symbionts that did that. And they probably, because we think they had capacious guts, had large fermentation chambers. And probably the strategy they had was to bite and swallow vegetation, sort of chomp and gulp, over and over and over again. We know that elephants, which are warm-blooded and have large heads, spend most of their time eating and cooling off. Sauropods are probably like that. They did a lot of eating to support their body. So how could they eat that much with such a small head with tiny little teeth? Well, I'll tell you some of the tricks that they had up their sleeve or up there behind their lips, if you want to think of it that way. Here we're looking at the anatomy of a sauropod and an ancestor. And just to give you this is a side view, left side view, the front is this way, the back is this way. This is the eye, this is the nostril. And this is an opening that you don't need to know about, but it's present in crocodiles and birds and their common ancestor. And this is the same set of openings in a sauropod. I should mention this red stuff here is where muscles attach, the chewing muscles attach. Okay, so this is how they're eating. One of the things that sauropods have done is that they've lined up their teeth. So the teeth meet in a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 fashion. So they have a precise or nearly precise occlusion like we do. So that when you bite on a piece of gum and you look at it, you can see there's lots of, you can see your teeth kind of match up. Sauropod teeth did that as well. They had matching dentitions. So there's a certain number of teeth on the upper jaw and on the lower jaw. Their ancestors did not do that. Sauropods also increase the size of their skull bones that house the teeth. So much so that they've even moved the nostril back towards the eye. And so the nostril gets pushed back, and so these teeth are massive, and they just get packed with teeth, which is really neat. So if you were to see a sauropod jaw in cross-section, you would see, as I'll show you in a second, you'd see it's full of teeth that look like this. Okay, and this is an example of one of the earliest sauropods that we have skulls for, just to show you how simple the dentition is. There's nothing complicated, there's no cusps, nothing like anything that Greg would be interested in, but rather they have sort of almost a leaf-shaped crown, and they have this wrinkling on their teeth. Their enamel's wrinkled, which is an adaptation, I think, a shape-based adaptation to increase the surface area of what is breaking down plants and just to reduce or to slow down the wear on those teeth, how fast those teeth are being worn down. This is an image of a sauropod jaw where you can see inside of it. We've removed some of the bone. We have permission to do this. We removed some of the bone from the outside so that you can look directly in at each of the teeth. And so this is a tooth that's nearly functional. That is, it's about to drop down and to be used. Okay, you can even see the wrinkling there on the outside of the tooth. We'll call that tooth 1. And behind it in the same family. So when I say tooth 1, I mean it's in like this position, this tooth, but these are the teeth behind it, which are the teeth that are going to replace it. And so sauropods will have 1, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 or 5 or 6 teeth that are waiting in line to drop down and be used. And somebody clever figured out that if we were to take a tooth like this and to cut it and to magnify it, you could see that there are these lines, what we call incremental lines. They're lines that grow incrementally that represent, we know from living animals, days in the life of that tooth. So we can measure how old this tooth is, how old that tooth is, how many days old it is, and how many days old this tooth is. And just by subtracting, we can estimate that the replacement time, so this tooth 1 is 315 days old, this one's 253 days old, this one's 190 days old. We can subtract and come up with an estimate for how often those teeth were placed. So these big, kind of bulky teeth that you find in animals like Camarasaurus from the Jurassic of North America, they replace every couple of months, a tooth will be replaced. So they're burning through teeth. Interestingly, sidebar, the tooth fossil record for sauropods is very poor. We don't find a ton of them in the fossil record because they're going through teeth and burning them, basically, and so they're gone when they're done. This is another graph showing you on one axis time, and here instead of going left to right, it's going from bottom to top. As many geologists will do, they'll kind of stack time as it's stacked in the rock record. So old is at the bottom and young is at the top. And so you can see this is the Triassic when the first dinosaurs appeared, the Jurassic, the Middle Period, and then this Cretaceous period. And what you've got here on this axis is something that has to do with how wide the teeth are. So on the right side, on the left side, the teeth are very fat, and on the right side, the teeth are very narrow. And so you can see where animals like Plateosaurus start out, that is the ancestors of sauropods, start out kind of in this range. And as we get to the Jurassic, the range kind of broadens and teeth get fatter. And then during the Cretaceous, teeth just kind of gets narrower and narrower and narrower, so that by the end of the Cretaceous, all you have are narrow teeth that look like this. So this is the tooth I showed you a slide or two earlier. This is Camarasaurus, which I showed you just now. And this is what a Diplodocus tooth would look like, or one of these late-appearing sauropods called titanosaurs, what they would look like. And so, I mean, to my eyes, those narrow teeth, they look much weaker than the broader teeth, and I might wonder why those things emerged. Well, it turns out that they're easier to pack in the skull, and these sauropods, like Diplodocus, so this is Diplodocus, this is the eye here, the nose is up here, all of this is jawbone, full of teeth, right? And so I'll do a little animation that's going to show you inside. Just these are all teeth inside here. All these circles you can see are just teeth that are filling these jaws. And one of the neat things that we learned when we did the same experiment, cutting the teeth into sections and then measuring, counting the lines, is that these animals replace their teeth even faster. So they're going through their teeth much more rapidly than Camarasaurus was. So there's like this tendency towards more and more rapid replacement of teeth. So these animals are investing. These teeth have a different surface area to volume ratio than the fat teeth do. In fact, there's more enamel per unit tooth in these teeth than there are in those fat teeth. And so they're packing their skulls full of enamel, which is the hardest substance that we have in our body, which is allowing them to really use that to burn through, we think, vegetation, to go through vegetation. So Diplodocus, average replacement rate every month, they were going through a tooth. Nigersaurus, oh, I didn't show you, I don't have it. I thought I had it. There's the next slide. Nigersaurus, which I showed you early on, that strange animal that Paul Serino and I were excavating, they're replacing their teeth every 16 days, so almost every 2 weeks. So they are really burning through teeth. And so these sauropod skulls, although they are small, and although they don't have a lot of it's a Spartan design, if you want to think of it that way, they've really invested in pushing up the relative amount of enamel in their skull. And so they're able to do a lot of biting with those teeth. Okay? Are there questions on skulls before I move to talking about necks? We can take questions at the end too, that's fine. So sauropod necks, they're called long necks, and this is the most fascinating part of their anatomy for me. This is an animal called Omaisaurus. It's from China, and it has 17 neck vertebrae. Mammals are limited to 7 neck vertebrae. Okay, so even a giraffe, which has an extremely long neck, has a long neck not by virtue of making more neck vertebrae, but by doing something different. Okay? And so does anyone know how giraffe necks get so long? What are they doing to make them so long? Yeah, they're really long. They've stretched them out. So that I didn't mean to make that a trick question or anything, but the neck elongation in giraffes is something that's related to the way that they grow. They just grow their long axis rapidly so that each vertebra is super long. Snakes, I don't mean to imply that they have long necks, but one way to make a long neck is to do what snakes do, which is to make more body segments, or in this case, somites. And so there are more vertebrae by virtue of making more body segments. That's another thing that can happen developmentally. Another way to do that is kind of an analog of what's being done here. Do anyone know how these, the long neck in these Paodong women is made in humans? It's made intentionally, and it's not intentional in sauropods, but does anybody know what happens to their skeletons? I can see you're doing this. What do you mean? They're pushing down their shoulders, exactly. So they're moving the boundary. So the boundary between your trunk and your neck is the collarbones and the shoulders. And what they've done is they've moved it down. They haven't added vertebrae. They haven't made them longer. They haven't added space between them. They've simply shifted the boundary. And that's something that there's a certain group of genes called homeobox or Hox genes are responsible for. And so that's something that can happen too. And it turns out sauropods do all three things to different degrees depending on which animal you're talking about. And so there are some sauropods that have long neck by virtue of having a few very long vertebrae, like Brachiosaurus or Giraffatitan here has 13 long vertebrae. Here are 12 short vertebrae. There are 15 relatively short vertebrae in Apatosaurus and 12 relatively short vertebrae in Camarasaurus. And to my knowledge, no two sauropods have exactly the same length neck acquired by the exact same means, which means to say an animal like Giraffatitan might have a long neck that might be on the order of as long as Apatosaurus, but by virtue of having fewer vertebrae, it's less mobile than an animal that has more vertebrae. So there are different strategies that are being employed here. And one of the things that I've not really suggested this in a paper per se, but I've always thought this about sauropods, that their most important adaptation for feeding is not in the skull or in the way that they bite, but it's in their necks. Because these necks are creating envelopes, three-dimensional spaces in which they can eat. And that neck is very important. But as you can see, the neck is cantilevered. It's out in front of the body. And that's very difficult to support. Imagine if you're trying to hold out like a fishing rod, which is quite light for a long time. That would be a challenge. And so how did sauropods do that? How did they get around this? Well, I'll tell you without showing you that they don't scale as beams. So they don't I'll explain some beam mechanics, some simple beam mechanics in a moment, but they don't scale as beams, typical beams do. They have other things that they do to get around some of the issues that are related to being big and having a long neck. And some of those are shape related, and some of those are related to material properties, what they're made of. If you can imagine it, think of that now. What could a sauropod do to its neck vertebrae to make them lighter? How would you make them lighter? This is something that Taryn O'Connell, former student, worked on when she was in my lab 100 years ago or so. Okay, so this is looking at vertebrae of sauropods. And so hopefully some of you are crazy about anatomy. This is what made me love sauropods, was the anatomy of their vertebrae. They're so fascinating to me. And so you're looking at an ancestor, if you want to think of it that way, of sauropods here. This is a neck bone. This is the front. This is towards the back. This is a sauropod. This is, again, the front and the back. You can see the scale bar. This was much larger than this one, but you can see I've made them so that one's 5 times as large as the other. One of the things that you'll immediately notice is that the sauropod has ball and socket joints. So there's a ball here, and it's harder to see, but there's a socket in the back. If we did a cross-section, you would see it. Across a socket here. And so they have these ball and socket joints. These animals do not. So the ancestors of sauropods did not have ball and socket joints. They had flat joints or cupped joints. So this is something that sauropods invented as related to having a long neck. Why was that important? Well, one of the things that ball and socket joints allow us to do is to have kind of limited translation, so moving in and out of the plane of the vertebrae. It keeps them articulated or in anatomical articulation. And it allows for them to move, to rotate. Think of the ball and socket joint as being a rotary joint, to rotate without kind of dislocation like this. And so these are, adaptations for safe mobility that allow sauropods to move their necks while still staying in anatomical articulation contact. And it actually increases the area of contact between them just by virtue of having that shape change that makes it a little bit broader. One of the wild things that I realized at some point was that, this ball and socket joint only goes one way in sauropods. What I mean by that is that the ball only faces the head and the cup only faces the body. There's no sauropod in which those relationships are reversed, in which the cup goes the other way and the ball goes the other way, or on the other ends of the vertebrae. It's only one way in all of sauropod history, in all of the vertebrae that have ever been found. Why is that so? What's the big deal about having vertebrae that are made that way? A student and I set to work on that. And one of the things that we have to think about is the way that ball and socket joints work. And when we think about it, one of the qualities of a ball and socket joint is that the center of rotation is on the ball end. And so this vertebra is rotating around a point that's on this vertebra. And so if you imagine the body being a fixed point here, and these vertebrae having the ball facing away, this makes for safe rotation. Safer rotation than this, because in this configuration, the vertebra is able to slip out of joint because the center of rotation is on the vertebra that's farther away. And in fact, this is a pattern that's not only present in all the sauropod dinosaurs, it's present in our fingers. So if you're bending your fingers like this, you're bending these joints, the interphalangeal joints are joints in which a cup and a ball meet one another, and the ball faces away from your hand and the cup faces towards your hand. It's present in all fingers and toes that we know about. If you think about your leg, standing on your leg, if the fixed point is the ground, there's a ball and socket joint here. Where's the ball? It faces away from the fixed point. And that appears as soon as animals begin to walk on land. That relationship shows up. If you replace a hip, some of you may have done that, the replacement always has the ball on the femur and the socket on the hip. But if you replace a shoulder, you can do it either way. You can replace the ball on the shoulder or the cup on the humerus, depending on the injury. So this is a truism that allows for very safe mobility. So I think that these necks were very mobile. They were able to move the animal's head around in space to avail it to all the different foliage that was in a three-dimensional area that was dictated by the length and the range of motion of that head. Another thing, and I just put this in after a conversation with one of Chris Seedor's students that I'll mention, one of the tough things about growing big, so there are some children in here that are still growing, and they will have growth plates. And if you're familiar with babies, you know that there's a soft spot on the skull that represents where bone is growing together and sutures that are fusing. Well, that's true in dinosaurs too. They have sites of fusion. And there's a trade-off in big animals between keeping those sutures open and growing and closing them and eliminating these points of weakness where those sutures can open. And one of the things that sauropods have done, and some other large animals have done, is to change the shape of the suture within the vertebrae. So here's a vertebra. I've left off the neural spine and the bottom of the centrum. But this blue trace here is the joint between the body of the vertebra and the part on top, the spine. And this complexity is something we can measure by measuring how long this line is compared to a straight line, the straight line distance. That's what this ratio is. And so if we go down the vertebral column from the neck all the way to the base of the back where the hips are, we can see that complexity goes up and it's highest in the shoulder region where the bones are being pulled on the hardest by the neck, which is hanging off the front of the body of the animal. So those front vertebrae are evolutionarily engineered to withstand a lot of pulling while they're still growing large. What else? I asked you to think about what a sauropod could do to change what it's made of in order to affect the surface area to volume ratio and this challenge of holding up something that's so heavy out in front of its body. Well, one of the things that we know about living dinosaurs, like birds, is that they have a very special respiratory system that's connected to these air sacs that invade the bone. So this is a latex. They've injected the respiratory system of a bird, and all these are air sacs. And so the body of a bird is full of these air sacs, makes them extremely light. What you might not know is that those air sacs invade the bones. This is a vertebra in cross-section, a trunk vertebra at the base of the neck here in cross-section, showing you all these pockets here that are full of air so that the bone is actually lighter. What's important is that this type of feature makes its way into the fossil record, so we can trace it in animals that also have pneumatized or air-filled bones. And sauropods are like that. These are two vertebrae. This is one from Morocco, from the Cretaceous. It's called Rabachisaurus. And this is one from India called we think it's Janosaurus. And it has these big pockets on the vertebra that invade and take away the bone and are filled with air sacs. And if we cut cross-sections through those bones, the inside of the bone has been replaced by air. So the vertebrae are much lighter. And so this cross-section is 63% air. This cross-section is nearly 60% air. And this is, of course, the shape of an I-beam, and it would have been resistant to bending in the sort of this way. This is a spongy tube that would have been resistant to twisting, we think. And so different strategies, different deployments of air within the body to evolutionarily achieve resistance to different types of bending or twisting within the vertebral column. So sauropods are holding out these long necks, but they're not made of bone completely. They're made of 50, 60, 70% air. Okay. The last thing I'll kind of, or one of the last things I'll kind of talk about, I'll touch on, is the other part of the skeleton that's, characteristic of sauropods, which is this columnar elephantine set of limbs that they are supporting their bodies on. In some ways, at least to my, the gestalt that I've gotten over however many years I've been studying them, it's the limb skeleton is one of the least variable parts of the sauropod skeleton. It's the one they happen to be also very highly preservable. So there's lots of leg bones in the fossil record, but they don't vary very much. And so it can be challenging to figure out whose leg you're looking at just on the basis of a bone like that. And one of the reasons for that is because I think they're under pretty strong selection pressure. They can't vary too much because they have to do a job, evolutionarily speaking, which is to support the body and to help move it around. So there's this kind of trade-off between being stable and supporting and being dynamic and moving. Okay, and this painting is showing a sauropod here with what we call columnar limb posture. It's what I showed you in that first picture of Diplodocus, where the bones are oriented sort of like a column. One of the things I just want to dispel at the very beginning is that sauropod limbs are just like any other tetrapod limbs, that is, four-limbed organism. There's nothing special about the way the limbs are constructed. All of you may know that there's a pattern to limbs. there's only one bone in the upper part of your limb, right? This is called the humerus. How many bones are in this part? 2. And then how many are in this? Lots. That's the pattern. 1, 2, lots. And the same in the leg. It's 1, 2, many. And that's the pattern that is the fundamental limb pattern that evolved 350 million years ago in an aquatic environment. 1, 2, many. 1, 2, many. And so sauropods just have that pattern. They don't have anything, they haven't added extra bones or any crossbars or anything weird to help support their body. They just have that pattern, and they just have bone. Okay? Returning to that original diagram I showed you of humans, I've got Yao Ming here, who happens to be, coincidentally, the same height as the longest thigh bone of any sauropod. It's 2.2 meters long, this thigh bone is. So this is a femur. You're looking at, this is the hip end, this is the knee end, this is the shaft of the bone. So there's not a lot of fancy projections or anything on this bone. It's just a very simple pillar. And this is just happens to be the same size as Vern Troyer, R.I.P. This is an adult, a small adult sauropod that has a femur that's on the order of 80 centimeters long. Now, if sauropods that were quite large were changing, sort of supporting their bodies by making their femora or their thigh bones super wide, increasing the cross-sectional area allometrically by just making massive femora, then we would expect that when we scale up this small one, it would look less robust than the big one. But in fact, that's not the case. There's not, and people have measured this too. We didn't just do it this way. I'm just not showing you that information. But there are some allometric changes that are related to being big in sauropods, but it's not a massive change like you get in some other organisms, some other tetrapods. So what's changing? Well, there are shape changes, and there are actually some material property changes. So they change what the bones are made of in a weird way. And there's actually, we think, some behavioral changes that I won't even really be able to tell you too much about, but I'll hint at towards the end. What are those changes? Well, here you can see a columnar posture in some sauropods that are in the Humboldt Museum in Berlin. This is Dicryosaurus. This is Giraffatitan. You can see a stegosaur for comparison. These limbs are arranged in a columnar fashion because that's what the joints tell us. The way they're configured suggests that's true. It's also true of other large quadrupeds like elephants. They're also arranged that way, we know, in life. Why is that posture a posture that is evolutionarily advantageous for a big animal? And this just to show you, I forgot. This is showing you an articulated or an anatomically posed arm of a sauropod called Jobaria, which is one that Chris and Greg and I excavated in Niger a long time ago. So here's the upper arm bone, 1, 2, and many. I don't have the wrist there, but there was a wrist there too. And you can see that these bones are oriented with kind of a long axis that lines up. Not only is the long axis of this limb straight, but the individual bones that make up the limb are straight. So that's something that's true of almost every single sauropod bone that we know of. Those limb bones, weight-bearing bones, are straight. Why might that be? Well, one of the reasons has to do with just the kind of the mechanics of bearing load. And this is just a diagram to show you that squatting is easy. Well, if you can get in that pose, it's easy. Because all of body weight, if you can actually get your knee into your armpit, like some people can do and just sit there, all of the body weight's kind of hanging on the tibia, loaded in compression. And that's what bone is best at resisting. It's better than bending, better than torsion. It's really good at resisting compression. Squats, on the other hand, are difficult. Why is that? Because the load exerts a moment on the joint, and it requires a muscular force and a bony force to resist that. And so it's hardest here when that load is farthest from the joint, and it gets progressively easier, and it's easiest, if you want to think of it that way, when the leg is fully extended, and these bones are loaded in compression. Okay? So sauropod bones are an adaptation to preferentially load bones in compression. But that never is completely the story. Because even when, I'll move over here even though I'm away from the microphone, even when I stand like this, or when I stand like this, my bones are not completely in compression because the hips are displaced from the center. And so these little schematics that we developed for a paper a long time ago, here's the center of mass, here's the hip. You can see that the hip socket has got a little distance from the center of mass. And so there's a bending moment that's imposed on a femur, just like there is on a table, or if you're sitting on a chair with 4 legs, there is a bending moment put on those legs. Okay? And so that bending moment is important in sauropods, and it's something that we can think about a little bit more carefully when we reflect on how beams work. And so this is a little diagram that's showing you the properties of a beam. And so here's the beam, and if you want to think of it this way, where the bone that we're going to be talking about is the beam in this case. And the properties of this deflection of a beam, how much it bends, depends on the properties of the load, that is, how much the load weighs and how far it is from the point of attachment. So the deflection is based on properties of the load divided by properties of what's resisting it. What is this beam made of? So that's the Young's modulus, or the sort of the material properties of that bone, and how thick it is. So how, imagine if a plank, if you were going to stand on a plank and I asked you, want to stand on a plank that's oriented this way or oriented that way, you would say that way because it's deeper and there's much more R. And if the R is in the denominator and it's got the 4th power on it, if you increase R by a little bit, you're getting a big gain in resistance. And so bending is less when R is big. Well, if we reorient this load and the weight this way, you can see if the foot here, or the bottom of the limb, is fixed at the ground, and the hip is kind of, the load of the center of mass is here, this bending moment is countered by a geometry of the bone that has its cross-section oriented so that transversely it's wider than it is front to back. That is, a sauropod thigh bone looking in front view is wider than when you look at it in side view. That's true of almost every sauropod bone, whether they're big or small, whether they're young or old. Okay? And so you imagine that a leg bone is roughly, one limb is supporting roughly 1/4 of body weight. When they're standing up on 2 legs, that's now half body weight. Okay, so there's a lot that's being imposed on these limbs. Another thing that sauropods do is they change what their bones are made of in a strange way. They don't finish the bones, and so this is a humerus, this is a femur. The ends of the bones are unfinished. They're roughened, and they're finished by cartilage, we think. And so if we take this thigh bone and we articulate it with the hip socket, they don't match, even when we know it's one individual. The hip socket is much bigger than the femoral head, the head of the femur. It's because it's a lot of cartilage that's in between, and cartilage is excellent at supporting weight and transferring loads at joints that have asymmetrical number of bones on either side, a humerus to 2 bones below, for example. Another thing we think sauropods did was that they were probably less athletic than your cursorial animals like this cat, which can, not only can it bend its back a lot, but it will take off on 1 foot and land on 1 front foot. The elephant, in contrast, we don't want to be in front of one or try to race it because they're fast, but they are not able to run. So they can't actually have an aerial phase where their bodies are off the ground. And people have put them on an inclined plane and push them to see if they would run. They won't do it. Little ones won't run. Scared them. Nothing happens. They always walk. So there's 2 or 3 legs on the contact with ground at once, and they have this kind of stiff-legged way of walking. And where we can't get at this directly with sauropods, we know from the footprint record, which is what I started with at the very beginning of the talk, that there is really only a couple of different ways that sauropods move in the track record. And so they did not have a varied locomotor repertoire in the way that animals like these smaller mammals did. Okay, let me try to sum up in the last, with a couple of slides here, 2 slides. I'm showing you an old-fashioned vacuum cleaner that maybe only a couple people would remember. I don't remember these vacuum cleaners, but I know that they existed. And the way that these vacuum cleaners work is that the canister that's creating the vacuum is extremely heavy. And so what people would do would be to move it into the center of a room, plug it in, and then they had a very long hose that you would use to vacuum the room with. That's what I think sauropods were like, basically. That they were incredibly heavy animals that would move minimally into areas of vegetation and then let the neck do a lot of the work, working a big feeding envelope. And after working that feeding envelope, they would move to another space and do the same thing, kind of decimating forests as they did so. And so sauropods were these large animals. They had these dimensional challenges that they met in the skull by a series of tooth-related adaptations that allowed them to bite and swallow food very efficiently, probably very rapidly. They had a neck that was held out as a cantilever that had adaptations for mobility and adaptations to lighten it. And they had these limbs, these bodies that were allowing them to be supported and to move, but not in an extremely dynamic way, in a much less athletic way. One of the neat things that people have suggested is that herbivores, I would say principally sauropods, but large herbivores, large dinosaurian herbivores, had such an impact on forests that canopies were open, like what you're seeing here. This is obviously a modern open canopy forest, but during the Jurassic and even in the Cretaceous period, in the Neotropics, for example, we think that these canopies were open and the vegetation was mixed and didn't include a lot of modern families that we have now. But just after dinosaurs went extinct, after the pressure, the intense pressure that dinosaurs like sauropods were creating by the vacuum cleaner effect that I explained, after this disturbance was removed, we began to get modern, very modern-looking rainforests with closed canopy, predominated by angiosperms, predominated by families that are around today. And so one of the interesting sort of takeaways that you can think about is that the demise of sauropods and animals like that paved the way towards the modern rainforests that we have in the Neotropics. And so with that, I will say thank you and open it up for any questions that you may have.